Coming up, Ryan. Got to get a little closer. Thank you, Don. That one's done. Last week, we broached the subject of immigration. Who remembers anything that we talked about last week? Okay. Okay, yeah. Okay, and we talked about the difference between the two situations we've got with immigrants coming from Mexico, and why are most of them coming? We think coming to work, coming for jobs, so they can make a better living for their families. I don't know, I haven't seen any surveys as to how many of them actually want to become American citizens, but we don't have any problem with Mexicans blowing things up and murdering people. Well, all right. There's a certain percentage of that, but it's not exactly the same because they're not coming over necessarily with that agenda as those who are coming from Islam often are. And that's a difference between the two pictures of immigration we have. How many of you have heard the news about what just happened in France? Was it today or was it yesterday? Two young men claiming to be working on behalf of ISIS entered a Catholic church building, took 5 people hostage, murdered a priest, stabbed another person. 86-year-old priest stabbed him and then cut his throat. Oh yeah, well, at any rate, we can't help but consider things like that when we talk about the issue of immigration. But I will say again, as I said last week, this isn't something that we should simply look at as American citizens. This is something we should look at as Christians, as children of God, and how would God expect us to respond or to react to this? How should we feel? How should we think? What I did, I just noted 7 different passages of Scripture that I think will weigh in on this. We talked about some of them last week, but what I want to do this week as we start, since we've discussed it to some degree last week and are getting reintroduced to it today, let's just read through those 7 passages to see how they, or if you even think they do, bear any weight in this discussion. So I need some volunteers. The first one is Matthew chapter 22, verses 34 to 40. Who will read that for us? Okay, Carolyn, Matthew 22, 34 to 40. That's your text. I need somebody to read from James chapter 2, verses 14 through 17. James 2, 14 through 17. James, well, there's the man. James has got James. I need somebody to read from John, 1 John chapter 3, verses 11 through 20. Okay, Robert. And then 2 John 4 through 11. 2 John 4 through 11. Who's got that one? Alan? Very good. Matthew 7, 15 to 20. Who will take Matthew 7, 15 to 20? See ya. If you fidget, I'm going to grant you. Okay, Kendall, Matthew 7, chapter 7, 15 through 20. I will read Deuteronomy 13. It's the whole chapter. It's not that terribly long, but I'll read it because it's a little bit longer. And Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 6. Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 6. Okay, we're good. We're ready to read. And Kit, did you get the Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 6? Okay. Matthew 22, 34 to 40.
But when the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together. Then one of them, a lawyer, asked him a question, testing him and saying, Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and the great commandment. And the second is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets.
Okay, thank you very much. That was Matthew 22, 34 to 40. If you want to make some notes on that real quick, that's the first two greatest commandments: love God, love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus' teaching there. The next one is James 2, 14 to 17. James chapter 2, 14 to 17.
What does it profit, my brother, if someone says he has faith, but does not have works? Can faith in him save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, depart in peace, be warm and filled, but do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead.
All right, that was James 2, 14 to 17. Now we'll hear from John, 1 John, chapter 3, verses 11 through 20.
For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was the evil one and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous. Do not be surprised, brethren, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren. He who does not love abides in death. Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. We know love by this, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has the world's goods and sees his brother in need and closes his heart against him, how does the love of God abide in him? Little children, let us not love with word or with tongue, but in deed and truth. We will know by this that we are of the truth, and will assure our heart before him in whatever our heart condemns us. For God is greater than our heart and knows all things.
Thank you, Robert. Now, from John again, but this time 2 John, verses 4 through 11.
I was very glad to find some of your children walking in truth, just as we have received commandment to do from the Father. Now I ask you, ladies, not as writing to you a new commandment, but the one which we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. And this is love, that we walk according to his commandments. This is the commandment, just as you have heard from the beginning, that you should walk in it. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not acknowledge Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh. This is the deceiver and the antichrist. Watch yourselves that you might not lose what we have accomplished, but that you may receive a full reward. Anyone who goes too far and does not abide in the teaching of Christ does not have God. The one who abides in the teaching, he is both the Father and the Son. If anyone comes to you and does not bring this teaching, do not receive him into your house and do not give him a greeting. For the one who gives him a greeting participates in his evil deeds.
All right, you see a little bit of a change in the tenor and the tone. In the first passages, we're talking about God's teaching through his Son about love, and how love is expressed by doing good to others, and faith is the same. Faith and love are very closely related in that way. You can't claim to have faith unless you try to do good for others, and you can't claim to be loving unless you do good for others. And then we come to a different viewpoint that talks about those who do not have the faith that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and how our response is in that situation. All right. Matthew chapter 7, verses 15 to 20.
Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Grapes are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles, are they? So every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. The good tree cannot produce bad fruit, nor can a bad tree produce good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. So then, you will know them by their fruits.
What's this passage about? False prophets, and knowing them how? By their fruits. All right. This is Deuteronomy chapter 13, if you'd like to read along with me. Deuteronomy 13. If a prophet or a dreamer of dreams arises among you and gives you a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes true, concerning which he spoke to you, saying, let us go after other gods whom you have not known, and let us serve them, you shall not listen to the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God is testing you to find out if you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall follow the Lord your God and fear him, and you shall keep his commandments. Listen to his voice, serve him, and cling to him. But that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he has counseled rebellion against the Lord your God, who brought you from the land of Egypt and redeemed you from the house of slavery, to seduce you from the way in which the Lord your God commanded you to walk. So you shall purge the evil from among you. Verse 6, if your brother, your mother's son, or your son or daughter, or the wife you cherish, or your friend who is as your own soul, entice you secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, whom neither you nor your fathers have known, of the gods of the peoples who are around you, near you, or far from you, from one end of the earth to the other end. You shall not yield to him or listen to him, and your eye shall not pity him, nor shall you spare or conceal him. But you shall surely kill him. Your hand shall be first against him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. So you shall stone him to death, because he has sought to seduce you from the Lord your God, who brought you out from the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. Then all Israel will hear and be afraid, and will never do such a wicked thing among you. Verse 12, if you hear in one of your cities, which the Lord your God is giving you to live in, anyone saying that some worthless men have gone out from among you and have seduced the inhabitants of their cities, saying, let us go and serve other gods whom you have not known, then you shall investigate and search out and inquire thoroughly. If it is true, and the matter established that this abomination has been done among you, you shall surely strike the inhabitants of that city with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying it and all that is in it, and its cattle with the edge of the sword. Then you shall gather all its booty into the middle of its open square, and burn the city and all its booty with fire, as a whole burnt offering to the Lord your God. And it shall be a ruin forever. It shall never be rebuilt. Nothing from that which is put under the ban shall cling to your hand, in order that the Lord may turn from his burning anger and show mercy to you, and have compassion on you, and make you increase, just as he has sworn to your fathers. If you will listen to the voice of the Lord your God, keeping all his commandments which I'm commanding you today, and doing what is right in the sight of the Lord your God. That was Deuteronomy 13. Now, Deuteronomy chapter 7, 1 through 6.
When the Lord your God brings you to the land which he says, and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God delivers them over to you, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them, nor show mercy to them, nor shall you make marriages with them. You shall not give your daughters to their son, nor take their daughter for your son. For they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So the anger of the Lord will be aroused against you and destroy you suddenly. But thus you shall deal with them. You shall destroy their altars and break down their sacred pillars, and cut down their wooden images, and burn their carved images with fire. For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth.
Very good. Thank you all for reading. Now, having read passages that are this seemingly different from one another, what are some conclusions that we should draw about the immigration question? We're God's people. We want to speak as the oracles of God, as Peter encouraged us to do. James.
Well, it would depend on if they're coming here
Okay.
He says, they're here to destroy you.
All right.
And from following me and loving me, He's providing and caring for you. But when you turn your back on God, you have nothing.
Sure. Now, do we understand the context from which we're reading? From Deuteronomy, both those passages, of course, part of the old law, part of the old covenant for the Jews. But the reason I had those put in here is because I believe there are principles taught in those passages that we need to be paying attention to, even if we may not practice them exactly like they did. I'm not advocating that we go to some city and burn it down because there's people there that preach false things, but that was what they were obligated to do under the law. It was for the spiritual safety of the nation. And of course we know what happened because they didn't do those kinds of things. They allowed idolatry to flourish, and it took them down the tubes. David?
I don't remember where I came across some thought, but I have relied on it a number of times in regard to understanding the will of God. And that we do not understand the will of God unless we recognize His ideal will, His allowed will, and His ultimate will. And it's in the realm of the allowed will that all these things happen. God is mindful of each individual every day, and He has allowed sin. And there is another factor that needs to be considered as to time, because God, for example, in Amos, a third or a fourth transgression, and then God's going to punish. And that's His decision when to so do. But it's a proof that He has allowed a thing to build so far, and then He acts. And that would be something that one would need to consider as to how far a certain wrong has developed before action is taken as God's way in His realm of allowance. So His ideal will is still there, and we know what we ought to do as to our behavior. However, when you get then to God calling on us to do some discipline, like He had in Deuteronomy 13, it's pretty blunt. And when we come into the new covenant, there are passages dealing again with discipline and relationships are wrong. All of that, I'm just saying the ideal will of God, the allowed will of God, and then ultimately there will be a judgment day, and His final sovereignty will be manifest. All that needs to be considered, and so a time element might be involved as to how far someone has drifted in a given direction. Maybe not doing something, but going along with what's being done before action is taken.
Okay. When Jesus talked about the two greatest commandments, where was He quoting from in the Scriptures? New Testament or Old? There was no New Testament. It was the Old. He was quoting from the Old. So the two greatest commandments, love God with all your heart, mind, and body, and love your neighbor as yourself, are part of the Old Covenant. That's the ideal will of God that Dayton's talking about. He wants everybody to love one another. What if somebody decides not to do that and they kill their neighbor? What does the law require in that case? The law requires that his life be taken. As a matter of fact, that's even a requirement prior to the law of Moses. I hope you remember when Noah got off the ark, Genesis chapter 9, God is talking to Noah. And it never occurred to me until years after I'd known what God told him, because God told him, if anybody sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. In other words, if somebody kills somebody else, then that person should be killed. Well, when God told Noah that, who was there? 8 people. It was Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives. And God is saying, okay, if anybody kills anybody else, we're supposed to kill that person. And that was established hundreds of years before God gave Moses the law on Mount Sinai. So that's a principle. So what we've got these two laws. The ideal will of God is that we all love each other, but then there is the allowed will that if somebody commits a crime, some of those crimes under the Jewish law were punishable by death. If we punish them, does that mean we no longer love them? That's part of the law. And there are always exceptions to keep things right. Dayton?
Drop it right there where you are, Saul of Tarsus.
Okay.
And how God viewed when a death pattern was unfolding there. There's Stephen for one, and then other brethren lives were taken. And yet, in the midst of that, God was able to detect something in Saul that made him such a powerful influence for God's purposes later.
Right.
There's a loud will changed into a conversion, turned into half the New Testament being written.
What was God's requirement when there was adultery? What was to be done with the adulterers? They were to be stoned. Do you know any famous adulterers that were not stoned? David committed adultery, was not stoned for it. There was punishment, but not stoning. So, and that little son died.
John, the woman taken in adultery,
Yes.
and Jesus responded toward her. I'm sure glad he'd been the ultimate judge in these cases.
Absolutely. Yes, I wish he could come down and tell us what to do now. But he's probably saying, it's in the book, boys. Just read the book. You'll figure it out. Now, here's the situation. We're reading from the Old Testament these principles that are there to guide us. And the New Testament tells us, read the Old. It'll teach you. It'll show you. There are principles there you need to understand. It's not as if God said, forget about the old now, just read the new. God's never said that. He keeps telling us to go back to the old. As a matter of fact, you've had a hard time finding a page in the New Testament that doesn't have a quote from the old on it somewhere. However, the Old Covenant was both a spiritual law and a civil law for the Jews. It wasn't the law for the whole world. It was for the Jews. It was spiritual and it was civil. The New Testament is not given to be a civil law. The New Testament is God's covenant with us through Jesus for salvation, and it has been established in such a way that this covenant can go into any nation and flourish under any government. Governments prosper more naturally when they function in accordance with the teachings and principles of the Bible, but governments are not obligated to keep the old law. But what does that do about the principles? How many of you as parents, don't raise any hands, we don't want to get any stories started, but how many of us as parents have been concerned over some of the people that our children have run with at times? What does Paul say about evil company or evil companions? 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 33. By the way, what's 1 Corinthians 15 all about? Anybody recall? It's about the resurrection. So why in the middle of a chapter on the resurrection does Paul insert evil companions corrupt good morals? Why were there some at Corinth who were not believing in the resurrection? Because people came in there and they started teaching that. And so they were being listened to, they were being heard, they were being given an ear, and by virtue of the false teaching of there not being a resurrection, people started to believe that, and they questioned the resurrection. And so Paul says, let me tell you about this resurrection so you won't be ignorant about that. And by the way, while I'm talking about this, let me warn you that if you've got evil companions that don't believe in this, they're going to corrupt you. So this is in the New Testament. It's the idea that we're reading in Deuteronomy 13. If you've got a prophet who's leading you away from God, you kill that prophet. What if that person leading you away is your closest dear friend or your family member? What do? You don't spare, you don't conceal, you kill them. How far into the future does God see? All the way. And he knows. Just like we know as parents, no, dear child, you can't have candy all the time, because we know what's going to result if our children eat candy all the time. It's going to be a negative result. Their teeth are going to get rotten. Their veins are going to corrode. Everything bad that comes with that processed sugar, boy, it's good, but it causes some bad things to happen in your body. And so we protect our children from that, because we know down the road it's going to have a consequence. And God is saying the same thing about evil spiritual influences. And I think we need to look at this with regard to immigration. Does anybody have any comments or observations at this point? I don't want to, because probably your wheels are turning and you're doing some thinking. Should we ever say there's no longer freedom of religion? Isn't that what we're all about in America? Now, how was that again? I didn't quite.
If you take away freedom of religion, you're enforcing your religion at that point.
Okay.
So you can't have both at the same time.
Okay. So we're saying as Americans, we will not dictate what anybody believes. How does that translate in this discussion? Or does it translate? Does it have a bearing? For example, what religion are most of the Mexicans coming over the border? Probably Catholic. Do you agree with everything in Catholicism? I'm sorry?
They do believe in Jesus in that Catholicism.
They do?
So there's a portion of it that they do believe. They know Jesus.
Right. And we all know, just like with almost every branch of Christendom, if you will, and I hesitate to use the word branch because that sounds like it's connected to the vine, and they're not, but denomination, with every different sect of Christendom, there are people who are aspiring to holiness and doing right, and there are people who wear a big cross and will cut your throat. We know that's true. But that's not the same question. Is Catholicism equal to Islam? How was Islam established? With the sword, with war, with conquest. Who did Muhammad kill? Anybody who got in his way. It's history. I'm not telling stories out of school here. I'm not trying to shed a bad light on anybody. I'm just saying this is history. People, the Crusades, the Crusades. Well, why did we have the Crusades? We have the Crusades to try to go down and free up some of the places that had belonged to Christianity, but that had been overrun and dominated by Islam. That's what the Crusades were all about. I'm not saying I agree with the Crusades, but I'm saying when you look at a map of the wars and the battles with the Crusades, there's just a tiny few of them. But when you look at all the battles brought on by Islam, they spread across northern Africa and up into Europe. They go all over the place, and they're still at it. Do all Muslims act violently? We know they don't. My family, we have personal friends who are Muslims. They would probably give their lives in our defense. When you read the Quran, however, and you read the Bible, you find out it's not simply two different religions. Islam is an ideology, and it's an ideology of hatred, of violence, and of a response to infidels. And by the way, who is an infidel according to the Quran? Anybody who is not Muslim. We say that as outsiders looking in, but even within Islam, do you know of any violence, Muslim on Muslim? Because there are some Muslims. And I've thought about this, and you do with this what you will. But I thought to myself, if a segment of the Church of Christ went off the deep end and started whacking people, killing people, I'd have a whole lot to say about that, and the world would know it. I'd be preaching, I'd be writing, I'd be going around every opportunity I had to say, this is not what the Bible teaches. This is what the Bible teaches about loving your neighbor and praying for your enemies and praying for those who persecute you. There is nothing in the Scriptures about killing those who are non-believers in Jesus Christ or the Bible or the church that Jesus established. This is what the Bible teaches. You can't do that with Islam. Those in Islam who say that violence is wrong cannot go to the Quran and pull up passages that teach fellow Muslims that their violence against the infidel is wrong, because it's not in there. There's a huge difference between Islam and other religions. Do I want my children being influenced with denominationalism? No, I don't. Do I want my children being influenced with Hinduism? No, I don't. Buddhism? No, I don't. Zoroastrianism? No, none of. If it's not Jesus Christ, I don't want them being influenced with it. But that's a completely different question than do I want my children to live in fear and intimidation from people who immigrate to this country and demand that we change to be like what they came from. And see, here's what just seems so crazy about it. People leave where they are because it's horrible. They come here and they want this place to become like what they left. Is that psycho? Is it okay to ask that question in a Bible class? And I'm not talking just as an American. I'm talking about somebody who wants to live in peace and harmony and security with everybody in the world. But if you invite people into your neighborhood and you know they have an ideology of hatred and violence, what should you expect? But eventual hatred and violence. Do you want a chapter of neo-Nazis to be established? And I used to use Hell's Angels as an example, but you know, the Hell's Angels, looking at some of these other groups, Hell's Angels aren't that bad. A lot of those biker gangs, they'll do you good now because they're bikers for Christ or whatever. And while we might not agree with everything they do and say, some of those guys are people you have the least to fear from as anybody. Yeah, there's different levels of bikers, of course, but what you've probably figured out by now is that I'm trying to think through this whole question myself. I don't have all the answers. I'm reading passages, these passages and other passages like them, and I'm wondering, what should my response be as a Christian? On one hand, I think, wow, if we bring them over, we could preach to them. We could teach them the gospel. But then I read the papers and I watch the news and I see what's happening when England has brought them over. What's happening in England? What's happening in Germany? What's happening in Greece? What's happening in France? What's happening in almost every country that has introduced Islamic refugees? And I'm asking myself, is it just about us showing love in the present day? Or is it also about us having love for future generations and what is going to come on their doorstep based on what we do today? I think there are all kinds of questions we need to be asking, and I want every one of the answers to be guided by Scripture. And I'm telling you, I don't have all the answers. Bill? All right, Bill, here we're going to hear some wisdom here.
After World War II, we had bases in Egypt, all up and down in Morocco, Pakistan, everywhere, because those people were starving to death. And when we got through building oil wells over there, the British and the Americans, the Arabs took them away from them. And they all got rich. One of my friends was stationed in Saudi Arabia, and the guy who got friendly with talked going to an exhibition. He didn't tell him it was going to be a killing. But this went to the square, and his little kids and women, everybody just showed up to watch this execution. Guy come out with a black hood on, a big old axe on his shoulder, and they drug this guy out and put him down there. When they chopped his head off, he flopped just like a chicken when you wring a neck. His body just went everywhere. And they were our friends. We flew through, well, I'm an Air Force man. We used to fly east and west and meet over there in the middle of Asia somewhere. Going to all of our foreign, what do they call that stuff? Where ambassador lives.
Oh,
Go to all those things.
embassy.
Had secret stuff and all. You can't deal with those people. If a guy wears a rag on his head, don't have anything to do with him, you kill his neighbor, anybody. They don't have any soul. Leave them alone. In Africa, it was the same thing. They were Muslim, but we didn't even know what a Muslim was back in '48. There's something else I was going to tell you, but, oh, and up to date, around 1890, 1880, 1990, I was running a worldwide commissary program, and they'll tell you, the government said, we don't go by, we're going to so many women and so many blacks, so many, they do. They want a certain number every one, and I tried to get a Mexican, and good, but the father in the Mexican families, he rules the roost. If father says no, because it has mobility in there, she can't just work in San Antonio, we might want to send her to Europe. No. All the Mexicans that had education were super people, and the ones that didn't were just grubbing for something to eat. I went on Easter basket with the chaplain, went in one of those places, and the guys were barbecuing in the bathtub. Had a big fire going, cooking up a storm. Came back 10 years later, and he was the mayor. So education is the answer to all these crazy people. But they don't want to know. The Arabs, there's nothing you can do with them, but just leave them out. Let them go home.
It's interesting you bring up this point about education. Any of you ever heard of a Sioux chief named Spotted Tail? He was famous among his people because when white men went west, Spotted Tail was a great Sioux war chief, and he said the time has come and my people need to be educated in the white men's ways. It's like he saw, okay, we live in tents and we hunt buffalo, and there's nothing wrong with that way of life, but he saw the writing on the wall. And like one guy said, you know, some of us see the writing on the wall, we just think it's addressed to somebody else. But he saw the writing on the wall, and he realized what my people need to survive in the future that's coming is education. And where Indians were educated, they prospered. And it's not because Indians were stupid, it's just that they had a culture that had a certain set of skills. And I'd like to learn some of those skills. And they were the skills they needed to survive in a hostile environment. Have you ever read anything about the Northern Plains in the wintertime? And those skills enabled them to survive. But when everything changed, when the white men came and the white men did some horrible things, that we're gonna starve the Indians out. Well, how are we gonna do it? Well, we'll just kill all the buffalo. Kill all the buffalo, they won't be able to eat anything, and they'll have to go all over the place, and we can catch them while they're running and kill them. It was horrible, the kind of things that happened. And yet, Spotted Tail said, if we're going to get out of this alive, we're going to have to be educated. Today, there's a wave of immigration coming from Islam, and instead of them becoming educated and assimilated into American culture and society, they want everything in America to change. I see that as problematic. There was a book we read, oh, well, that's the second bell, isn't it? If you ever go overseas and travel, hopefully, I'd like for everybody to be able to do that, but don't ever go overseas and start criticizing the way they do things over there. That's pretty bad manners, isn't it? What if somebody came into your home and said, oh, you don't clean your house right, or you don't fix the right kind of food, or you don't dress right? What would you tell them?
Tell them to go home.
There's the door. Hit the road, bub. It's my house, my rules. Anyway, man, our time's over. If you've got questions about this, I would like to hear them. Please write them out and give them to me. So I've got some more study I want to do on this, and like I said, I don't have all the answers. We probably will not come back to this next week, however, unless you just demand that I do. We'll study something else, some other hot topic. And if you've got a hot topic you want to approach in this class, write that down and give it to me, and we'll see what we can work up on that.
Thank you, Marty.
Yes.
I read up on the internet about parents. It's really good. They started it, they run out of power during all their advances. They took in the Persians and the Iranians, and the Iranians, the Persians, they eventually kicked the Arabs out because you're taking the lion's share of the fighting for. See, now the Arabs, they're really out of the picture. It's the Persians and the Iranians and the Iraqis. And it's really interesting when you get into it. So, look it up.
It's
Look up on Google, just look up Arabs.
not just Islam, it's the influences of the different cultures within Islam. Yeah.